So this is joint work with Molly Lipscomb from the University of Virginia, generously funded by the Gates Foundation. So many key, wow, there's screens everywhere. Many key markets in developing countries, right, suffer from market failures, right? So externalities, search frictions, adverse selection, and they arrive at inefficient outcomes. So one policy solution is for governments or NGOs to act directly as the intermediary between supply and demand, right, and subject to some constraints on the design, namely budget constraints. So this poses a set of challenges, right? So one would be how to ensure subsidy dollars reach households who require and will actually use the assistance, so that's targeting. Another would be how to compete against or alongside existing markets to deliver services. This is kind of relatively understudied. A lot of interventions were dealing with like a novel good or a novel service, and there aren't competing providers. And then third would be how to determine whether a design is sustainable before attempting scale up. Right? So these are complicated questions, and we're going to take an explicitly mechanism design or market design approach. So we're going to measure the fundamentals necessary to determine optimal policy, and then we're going to solve for and implement the optimal mechanism, and then test the solution's impact. Right. So here's the good that we're going to be studying. It is called desludging. On your left is mechanical desludging. Households in peri-urban areas in Burkina Faso have underground tanks into which human fecal sludge goes. When the tank fills up, right, this is a very densely populated area, so they can't, this isn't like a rural situation where they can just pick the outhouse up, move it a couple yards, put it back down. Right? This tank has to be emptied. It's usually made of concrete, and the lid is sealed on top of the tank to keep the smells inside. Right? So your first option for emptying your tank when it fills up is to call a mechanical desludger. It's a gasoline-powered pump with this hose. Right? So the truck comes, they crack the tank off, they put the hose in, they use a gasoline-powered pump to remove the sludge. Your other option is called manual desludging, and you have two options here. You or a local provider can open the tank yourself and then empty it yourself. You have a bucket, you have a shovel, you lower the bucket in. Sometimes people jump into the tank to get at the bottom. You become a vector of disease, especially if you're doing this. People in your family are now exposed to illness. Another problem here is that once you've emptied the pit, you're not going to take it very far. Right? So this truck will carry human sludge out to a treatment center, hopefully. Right? They might dump it somewhere, but it's certainly going to go further than here. Normally it's buried in the neighborhood, and then when it rains, it contaminates the area. So this is a big problem. So let's just go through the market failures to make clear what the problem is. So to find a trucker, it takes a long time. So the median is 12 days, and this has a long tail. So people can end up searching for a very long time. Because of that, when you do find a trucker, they have a bit of market power. Right? They know that if you reject them today, you face that starting that search from scratch. That's not very promising for you. So they're going to be able to price you above their marginal cost. Right? So we have market power. The next one is externalities. Right? So manual desludging has negative consequences for people besides the decision maker, especially children. So diarrhea is a leading cause of death of children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Now all those, at the end of the day, we then have the incomplete information problem. So households and service providers are going to have an incentive to lie about their willingness to pay or their cost, especially to us. Right? So if you wanted to intercede in this market and try to design a better system, there's certainly cause for you to wish to do so. Right? So this is a case that we would be, as a society, interested in subsidizing mechanical, but we're going to have to deal with this incomplete information problem. So this issue of targeting demand is a popular and important one. Right? So many households who receive subsidies or subsidized goods may not use them, and many who receive these subsidies might have purchased anyway. Right? So this could be resolved through screening by imposing small effort costs. Large subsidies may be necessary in order to get the poorest people to take up. And then working with the supply side makes your possibilities even bigger. And then using covariates to help assign treatment can increase overall take-up. So what we're interested in is combining all of these into one framework in some sense. Right? So a lot of people don't have like a prior, like so what are things that people have done to, sorry, question?
So instead of subsidizing the households, why not, it seems like there's a financial market failure on the trucker side.
Yeah.
Why not just somehow subsidize those or give trucks out? It seems like you want more competition on the trucker side.
Okay, so there's arguably excess capacity on the trucker side.
Oh. Well, then why is it 12 days? Why is it so hard to find?
Yeah, so the trucks don't, like you can imagine, you don't want these trucks near centers of social and economic activity. So they're pushed outside of cities, or they're kind of roaming around like ambulances. And that's what kind of like gives rise to the search problem in the first place. And there's a sense of like, during the rainy season, demand for these trucks goes way up. So you can justify the fixed cost in terms of the capital over the course of the year that way. Like there's all these other jobs you can be doing. So the biggest revenue is not necessarily coming from this, depending on the trucker. Right? So that's why you can have like a lot of capacity and a lot of trucks, but not necessarily low prices. Right? It's a combination of search and so the supply side is interesting.
That suggests maybe creating an app so it's easier to search for a truck.
Create an app so it's easier to search for a truck. So we're going to try to centralize the market in some sense. And even if you just have the app, you're not necessarily putting them in direct price competition. So we're going to be running procurement auctions to kind of like do all this. Put them in price competition, and then you just call us and we find you a trucker. Or we know truckers. Good. Okay. So just some vocabulary to think about what typical solutions would be. Proxy means testing works roughly this way. You use an existing data set to develop a predictive tool to decide whether a particular household falls above or below a given poverty threshold. This is often tied to an official poverty line. In very sophisticated places, people will have proof that they fall above or below the poverty line, and that makes this task easier. Then, given the subsidy budget, you send out your enumerators to survey households and determine who gets the assistance. Right? So there's two problems here. One is the subsidy might not be large enough to help poor households. Right? So coupons often go unclaimed in these schemes. The second one would be that it tries to exclude relatively rich households from participating. You'll see why I think that's not a good idea later. Another option would be something like you just run procurement auctions. Right? So when a household needs a desludging, they can call up, you run an auction to minimize the procurement cost, and then you're going to pass the lowest bid to the household who can then accept or reject. Sounds like a good, off the cuff, that's what an economist would come up with, sounds like. But there's kind of two problems that I'd like to point out here. In large part, this is subsidizing relatively rich households who probably would have purchased anyway. So it's reducing their search time, and it's bringing their prices down. It's allowing them to pool with poor households who have lower willingness to pay. But it might not bring the price down enough to get poorest households to purchase. Right? So these kind of standard solutions have a couple drawbacks. So what we're going to do, here's a rough sketch of the project. We're going to collect market data on one group of households, their most recent desludging experience. And we're going to use a very slight generalization of the second price auction to elicit their willingness to pay for a desludging from us. Right? And we're going to use similar auctions to elicit firms' costs. So that's going to give us a snapshot of the market and the underlying distribution of willingness to pay and costs. So stage 2 of this project is that we're going to use this to design an incentive-compatible pricing rule that's going to maximize use of mechanical desludging subject to a budget constraint. So for each household, we'll have $3 to play with. And then in the last stage, we will go out to a new set of households, and we'll deploy this rule on them and see how that impacts mechanical utilization, market share of mechanical, and then health indicators relative to a control group who does not have access to our market. All right. So that's the basic plan for the paper. Right. So the market share of mechanical desludging in our treatment clusters in a pooled regression is going to go up 6.5%. And if we look at the most heavily subsidized households, right, it's going to go up 10.9%. And what's going on is, in the richer groups, their market share for mechanical services is already very high. So there's not a lot of room to improve. And price, giving them subsidies doesn't really move the market very much. In the poorest groups, that's where the treatment effect, this 10.9%, is appears. And then when you average across all of the groups, that's how you get to the 6.5%. So of this 6.5, it's really this group that's driving the treatment effect. Okay. Mechanical desludging use increases. So this is at the level of the cluster. This is at the level of the household. It's a similar outcome. It's going to go up by 10.2 percentage points among the poorest households who purchase desludging. And manual desludging is going to go down by a similar amount. Right? So what we're doing is replacing manual desludgings with mechanical ones. Right? Diarrhea incidence among children exhibits a 5 percentage point decrease in the most heavily subsidized households relative to the control group. And this is largely occurring through spillovers in neighborhoods where there are more poor households who are treated through the platform. And then if you ask, did you lose a lot of money? No, it's not like I had to have my wages garnished by Gates Foundation or something. Yeah?
On the cost point, that's attaching zero cost to the effort of data collection, or is that after you account for the cost of running all these servers?
So this is from the perspective of the design. No, it doesn't. So the answer is no.
Because I'm just thinking as a government, if I'm going to run this market, then I have to get the data. And
that's I definitely don't want to overstate this. This is talking about within the context of did we hit the budget balance for the Yes.
So as I understand this, you're showing us that this market did a whole bunch of good in a variety of dimensions. Are you going to show us what would have been achieved with a different market design, or we should just think about this as one example of a very effective market?
Yeah, the answer will be yes if you believe structural counterfactuals. Yeah, well, I'll show you what would happen with proxy means testing, with auctions without a subsidy, with auctions with the same size subsidy, and if I just gave everybody the same price, which is equal to the current price, and I'm going to call that a centralized market, but of course there's GE effects, and we can debate.
But just following up on that question, didn't you already know that from the initial survey and you got the values and the costs? Or why did you need to do the second stage after that?
The experiment?
Yeah. Because if you could do all if you had the underlying parameters structurally, can't you just simulate everything out from there? And I guess you can go back and match.
Yeah, you can. I believe it worked because there was an experiment. If you had told me the numbers and things, I don't know that I would have believed you, so I guess it's more of just an epistemological type, where do you land on the spectrum of do you believe structural results or not? And that's, So we wanted to do the experiment to say nope, those are the numbers. Does that? Okay. So just to motivate why we set the rule up the way we do, I just want to go through a little bit of mechanism design. Right. What we're going to base this all around is that some information is observable to officials who are running some kind of platform. So in this case, we're thinking of ONEA. They're the local municipal authority that does water and sanitation. So I can just walk by a house and look at the dwelling quality and its size. And if I'm working at ONEA, I know the utility bills because I'm the one sending them out. I know, how much money these households are spending. I can look at the compound. How does it look? Are they doing urban farming? All kinds of things. And I can look at the state of the pit. So these things I'm going to call observable. Right. Each household, however, has a privately known willingness to pay. That's W. And they have a privately known reserve price, R. Right. So willingness to pay, right, is kind of like this abstract, what is the maximum amount without budget constraints you would ever be willing to pay for this service? Right. On the other hand, they have the outside option of going to the search market and getting a price of R. Right. Now, whether or not they actually get the service depends, in the absence of us, on whether W is bigger than R. But their interactions with us are going to be governed by their beliefs about this R. Right. So if they think they can do better than the price we quote them, they're just going to say no to us. Right. So this leads to, if we offer them a probability P of getting a desludging from us at a price of T, right, with some probability, right, they can get it from us, W minus T, and with some probability they're off on their own and they get the max of 0 and W minus R. Right, so that's how we're modeling their utility. So we're normalizing the utility of manual to 0. So the idea here is that any method of trade that we could design is essentially equivalent to just having the households report these types, W hat, R hat, and that's going to determine the probability of trade and a price. But to make this design exercise respect their ability to both opt out of the system and misrepresent themselves, because there's no way I can get at those, we're going to impose the design of this direct mechanism to incentive compatibility and individual rationality constraints. Right. So a mechanism is going to be incentive compatible if for any willingness to pay and any report of it, and any reserve price and any report of that, given your x, the probability of trade times your willingness to pay minus the price that we're going to charge you, plus 1 minus that times the outside option that you would have gotten. So this is your expected utility from the mechanism, being honest, has to be better than your expected utility if you were to lie and report W prime R prime. Right? So we're just saying it has to be in everyone's best interests when we show up at their house to participate honestly in our game. Right? The second issue is that they shouldn't want to opt out. So for all willingness to pay, all reserve price, and all x's that households might have, right, the probability of trade times their net benefit of working with us, plus 1 minus the probability of trade times their net benefit without us, has to be at least as good as saying, like, I don't even want to talk to you guys. Leave me alone. Go away. Right? And we can transform this easily to net values. Right? So then we have the probability of trade, given your reports and your observables, times your net benefit of trade on the platform, minus your outside options.
Can I just ask an arithmetic question?
Yes.
So why are you subtracting off the R from the one side but not the other? Like if they participate in your mechanism, why isn't it normalized so that if you get R, that's essentially 0, like it is over if they don't participate in your mechanism?
Aren't I? So if you participate with us and you trade with us, you're going to get your W minus T. So the R becomes irrelevant. That's kind of like sunk. That's in the past. You're trading with us. Now, if you either don't trade with us or we make you an offer that you're like, no, right? That's when you get either 1 minus P times the best of 0 or W minus R. Right? So that's this term here. Right? This is where we say, no, you're not allowed to trade with us. Or you could just walk away entirely. Right? So this equation is making us respect your...
Okay, I understand. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
How should we think about walking away entirely? I mean, you spoke about this a little bit, but to the extent that some of us are walking away entirely to get mechanical desludging elsewhere, I wouldn't necessarily think you should impose individual rationality everywhere.
OK.
Maybe I get the same service, I just don't get it from you. And if what you care about is the number of people who get this service.
Yeah.
So how should I think about your IR constraints on this?
Yeah, so we're thinking of, so when we talk to people about desludging and their attitudes towards it, we wanted to have other dimensions. We wanted to like screen them on stuff like if it was faster or the trucks were cleaner. And it's like flights on airlines. They just care about price. So from what you said, I can imagine that like mattering if we were like ensuring the product met certain qualifications we were worried about, or like maybe we could ensure that the sludge goes to a treatment center and we placed social value on that, things like that. So those are not incorporated here. We're assuming that if you walk away from us, you can get essentially a draw from the same pool of desludgers that we have, which I don't think is like unreasonable. OK. So when W is bigger than R, when your willingness to pay is above your reserve price, right, you're going to buy the service anyway. Right? So this, if you look right here, W minus max. So W minus the max of 0 W is R. Right? So when you're going to buy the service anyway, this is intuitive. All you care about is the reserve price. Right? I can't get you to tell me your true value. Right? Similarly, if W, the other case, and when R is bigger than W, right, R is bigger than W, so the max of this is 0, so then it's W. So if you weren't going to buy it anyway, right, what matters is your willingness to pay, because if I charge you too high a price, that's when you'll walk away from trade with me. Right? So this term here, W minus max of 0 and W minus R, is actually just the min of W and R. And this is the only thing that I can incentivize revelation of. Right? Because only one of them enters your decision problem. And so if you were going to buy anyway, the relevant thing that you would like to tell me is really your outside option price. If you were not going to buy anyway, right, the price that you would have gotten is irrelevant. What matters is your willingness to pay. So we can only incentivize the minimum of these two things. And I'm going to call it eta. OK. OK. So what is the platform trying to do? They're trying to maximize take-up of mechanical. Right? So if they go through us, they can get the service. But if they don't go through us, there's some probability that they're not going to purchase. Right? So the only households who are going to buy on their own in the market are those for whom their willingness to pay is above their reserve price. And then we impose the constraints that we got on the last couple slides. And then the last piece is ex ante budget balance. Right? So what I would like to do is make sure that ex post I haven't spent way more than the subsidies that I have available. So this is what's imposing kind of fiduciary discipline on us. If we didn't have such a constraint, we would just give low prices to everyone and rack up a huge deficit. But we're not allowed to do that. Good. So this is the problem, right, that we would like to solve. Does this sound?
Have you built in the procurement option and you know exactly what costs are?
At the time that we did this, we did not know. So the CX down here is, we had a guess of what it would be, but we're using basically 17,500, which is a little bit above the average price that households pay.
But the experiment that you do includes the procurement option.
So we're going to be buying through procurement auctions, but I'm going to be talking almost entirely about the demand side today. And we're just going to plug in a guess from our first couple auctions to see, like, what we had.
So risk neutrality matters a huge amount for your
Yes.
computation, right?
Definitely.
It linearizes all of this.
In it what?
It linearizes the problem in a lot of ways.
Yes.
As
Yeah.
always, of course. But should we worry about that? I mean, they're not actually risk neutral, these households. They're very poor households.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So ideally, we'd have an even bigger sample size and get information about risk aversion.
No,
So-
I'm not even saying you want to elicit it. It's just
Yeah.
it becomes a much harder numerical problem, I guess. Otherwise,
Yeah.
even if you knew the coefficient of relative risk, but yeah.
Yeah. So my claim would be that, like, in getting all this information, stuff like that, we're going to use dominant strategy games. So you can think of them as, you can think of the data that's coming in as being the certainty, the compensating variation rather than willingness to pay. And then we're going to make take it or leave it price offers, and there's no risk there. So the mechanism will ultimately be deterministic. So, yeah.
Do you have anything to say on using fines to say, look, if you don't mechanically sludge, you're subject to a fine?
Yeah.
How much would that, and will you be able to estimate the impacts of that policy versus other policies?
So I guess our claim is that ONAA doesn't really have the monitoring capacity to implement such a system, because you would go out in the morning and there would just be a pile of sludge. And this is largely done at night. So the manual is largely done at like 4 in the morning. So it's really hard to implement monitoring and enforcement policies. Can we do a counterfactual? I'd love to talk to you about which one you would want. We do a subsidy counterfactual, and if you think of a fine as just the opposite of that, we could plug that in and try to think about how that would work. But then that gets back to the risk aversion. OK. So in mechanism design, there's a key result that mechanisms are incentive compatible, right? If and only if the payment made is equal to the total surplus minus a share that goes to the household. Right? So this is like the foundation of mechanism design. Musa and Rosen, 1976, and Meyerson, 81. This is kind of like the tool that's used to build mechanisms. And the reason that is that the expected payment that a household makes is the expectation of the surplus minus the household share. And what we can do now is convert it into this kind of abstract quantity that we call a virtual value. So I have a slide to kind of give you some intuition about what that is. What would a pure profit maximizing household do? Right? They would say, what's the probability that the household purchases my services? My net revenue would be T minus CX. Right? This is the profit I'm making on the sale. Okay? So I'm going to maximize my expected profit. And that's going to give me this classical first order condition from Principles Micro. Right? So I make higher revenue on the inframarginal sales, but there's a lost marginal sale, and I'm trading those two things off. Right? I can rewrite it in the following way. Put marginal cost on the right-hand side, and then the left-hand side is this quantity that we're calling the virtual value, and it represents marginal revenue. Right? So alternatively, you can think of it this way. The price is equal to the actual marginal cost of production plus a term that represents the agent's informational rent, how much they have to be compensated to reveal their information. Right? So this piece is kind of like a abstraction, like this Platonic ideal of like what's the price of information. So putting that all together, we can think about the platform as a profit-minded social planner. Right? And what they're going to do is try to maximize this Lagrangian. Right? So here's my budget constraint. Here's quantity. Right? Subject to this constraint that the probability of trade is not decreasing in eta. Right? So, but because the probability of trade enters linearly, all of the incentives for the platform come down to this. So super interesting to me, at least. So there's this marginal benefit of funds times the profit they make on this household. Right? So that's marginal revenue minus marginal cost. Right? So if I was a monopolist, I would only care about that piece. It's weighted by the benefit of funds. And then this is the probability of a switch, essentially conditional on a report of eta. Right? So when a household says to me what their minimum of their W and their R is, I kind of update my beliefs about the likelihood that they will switch from manual to mechanical. And I want to pick all the households for whom this quantity is strictly positive. Right? That characterizes essentially the optimal mechanism. Right? So the intuition about this is that a higher eta type can always impersonate a lower eta type. So any attractive offer you make to people with low ability to pay or willingness to pay has to kind of also be made to people with high ability to pay or high willingness to pay. So in this optimal mechanism world, right, you would cut off participation here. You would find the type where you exact the benefit of raising additional money from them and the probability of them switching is exactly balances out. Right? So if the benefit of additional funds was very high, you're placing all the weight on the profit motive, and you behave like a profit maximizer. If the benefit of additional funds is low, that doesn't matter, and you want to focus on the people who are going to switch. Right? So you're behaving like a convex combination of a profit maximizing monopoly and a social planner. Right? So you can decompose the optimal price into a couple pieces. You're going to take the marginal cost. You're going to add the agent's informational rent. And then you're going to give a discount based on the likelihood that you think they're going to switch, weighted by the Lagrange multiplier of an additional dollar. So this is helpful. This tells us how we should be thinking about which households to target. And it tells us that a posted price mechanism is optimal. OK. So we're going to take that. And we're going to then, so I don't know, I'm split between just like charging ahead and being like, does that sound good? Does anyone have any questions? OK, I'm going to keep going. So then we go out and we do this. So we want to design this optimal personalized prices to maximize switching. So we're going to go to households, and we're going to record information about their previous desludging experiences and find out information about this point at which they switch. What's their eta? Right. So if you think about what happens when we look at a household, in the background, there's some latent index. Right? If it's low, they plan to buy mechanical. If it's high, if it's low, they plan to buy manual. If it's high, they plan to buy mechanical. Right? If we offer a price that's lower than their mechanical price, they will switch to us. These are the people that you might not like or something. You might be against them getting aid. Right? They're the people who would have bought anyway, and that's the demand that we're just replacing. On the other hand, if we find a household who planned to buy manual, but we quote them a sufficiently low price, right, they will switch. And these are the people who were really interested in getting involved in the platform. Right? But the trade-off is that you don't necessarily need to throw these people away. You can just charge them high prices. And if they say yes, you can take that revenue and use it to relax your budget constraint and help these people. That's what the Lagrange multiplier is doing here. It's saying, OK, if you can find me somebody who's really likely to switch, that makes me more likely to include them in the platform. Right? On the other hand, if I can make a lot of revenue off these people, but they're not likely to switch, I would also like to include them in the platform. So what we use, and this is kind of important, these are the variables that we're using to target households. So one is past desludging frequency. If you were running a platform and households were enrolled in it, you would be able to tell how often they need the service. Their water bill. Does their house precarious, concrete story, or rooming house? So our enumerators wrote this down. Other households in compound. Do they own the house or not? Pit distance to road. The last trip, did they have to use more than one truck or not? Electricity bill. And then these ones, number of people in household, number of women in household, household head educated. We can talk. So one of the things we're working on now is changing these variables. And what is kind of interesting is that as you throw variables out, you tend to still have a similar treatment effect, but your budget balance falls apart, and you start spending lots and lots of money. Right. So for this exercise, what we ideally want are variables that are robustly correlated with whether or not they're going to buy manual on their own and what the price would be that they would face in the market, because that's going to help us kind of like pinpoint who belongs in either group. Right. So using that, we can have a model of what the prices are that they're likely facing in the, yeah?
Dynamically incentive compatible if you need to ask about their previous desludging behavior?
So there's a group of questions that are going to come back to, we don't think you can really lie about how much sludge you're producing, or because it's a biological process. Yeah. So if you're consistently buying desludgings through this call center, we're going to have that information about you. And then there's potentially people on the margin who could maybe do a black market deal to keep their, but then you have to ask yourself, is that, I think it's interesting to think about the dynamics, yeah.
I guess what I wasn't worried about, can you lie about it, but if you know that your use this time is going to affect the price that you get charged, next time you need it, that might affect your decision.
Yeah.
What to do this time would be a forward-looking one.
Yeah. So we're thinking of the platform as kind of yeah.
You're thinking about the benefits of introducing
a consistent, long-lived agent.
You're not thinking of the long run. You're not thinking about steady state. You're thinking about.
So even in steady state, the strategy that so for me to actually benefit from kind of lying, I would have to somehow hide the fact that it's getting desludged. Mechanically outside the platform, and that's where I think that's interesting, but we don't have that kind of in the paper. But I think in the dynamics, if you can, you have treatment centers, you're tracking the trucks, you could track households use as well. So it would be, I think it would be observable, but we can talk about that more.
My question was exactly the question you were about to answer, but didn't, which is, so there's a survey, and it's using some reports from the household.
Yeah.
But not, that's not a mechanism. At that point, it's just they just provide you with hard, verifiable information. It's the incentive compatibility starts only after you got this information. That seems a little odd.
So
the initial survey isn't, people can't manipulate what they're saying.
So I would claim that the stuff on that survey is largely not manipulatable. Okay. There are a few things that we can argue about, and we can throw them out, redesign it, and I can tell you what would have happened. And the short answer would be your budget balance numbers get worse, but the treatment effect numbers are similar. Because you're having a harder time categorizing who's rich and who's poor, and you make more mistakes as I make your information worse. But as long as you have the electricity bills, things look pretty good. And the water bills. Those are really powerful. And also the house, how many levels, is it precarious? Those kinds of things are big indicators of wealth. And I'll show you more evidence of this kind of later. So this model tells you what prices are likely to be, right? But it doesn't tell you how people would respond to kind of a novel experiment. Someone shows up and they're like, hey, what would you be willing to pay to switch? So what we do there is we play this kind of simple game with them. So we say, I'm going to set you up with 8 competing households, but only k less than 8 are going to be selected to win. Right? We're going to ask each household to make an offer W for a desludging. the highest K offers are accepted, and all winners are asked to pay the K plus first price. Right? So this is going to tell me what those ADAs are. Right? What are the prices at which people would switch from whatever they're doing in the market to buying from us? Right? So if K is 1, this is the second price auction. If K is bigger than 1, it's still a weakly dominant strategy to bid honestly. And we motivate this by fairness. So we say, look, if you win and someone else loses, right, you should be willing to pay at least what they would have paid. Right? So that's a fair price. And then we say, like, well, look, if you overstate your value, right, there are situations where you would win and you would have preferred to have lost, right, because the price is above your actual willingness to pay. Yeah. And if you understate this value, there are situations where you're going to regret it because someone else bid less than you but above your bid, and then you lost when you could have profitably won. So the best thing you can do is just give me your best guess of the price at which you would switch to us. Right? We play the game a few times, and we try to convince them that it's in their best interest, but it's ultimately up to them to tell us whatever they want. Right? So this is how we put together a model of demand for each household. Right? We then take this model of demand and we put it back into the problem that we looked at earlier. Right? So what I want to do is maximize quantity subject to incentive constraints and everything else. But we found that the optimal solution was posted prices. So what I'm going to do now is say, OK, I'm going to maximize take-up of mechanical services subject to this budget constraint. Right? So here's the platform demand. Here's the people who do not buy from us. This is them buying in the market. And then we have this budget constraint of subsidies plus demand on the platform times the margin that we're making has to be at least as big as 0. And then these are the prices that people actually use for these transactions. So we strict attention to that grid. So the optimal plan actually looks like this. There is a little bit in 8 and a little bit in 12, but we move them to 10. And then you have, and that's for the practical purpose of we have to figure out how to assign prices to covariates later. So we have a bunch of people getting 10. Those are our most subsidized households. We have a bunch of people getting 15, and then 17, 5, and 20. And the market average is a little bit to the right of 15,000. OK. Right. So once we have this plan, right, I'm going to use an ordered logit rule to say, OK, what are the observables of the households that lead us to put them in these bins? Right? So we're going to take that rule, and then we're going to deploy it on a bunch of new households. And we're going to test the impact of this pricing rule. So there's 2 ways you can think about this. One is we're literally saying this is a good way to do policy. Go full technocrat and maximize take-up subject to your budget constraint. Embrace your inner engineer. Let's just do it. The other is this is giving us some kind of upper bound on what you could achieve over all possible policies that are in this discussion. Right? So you can interpret it kind of either way. So these new households, right, we get them together. Our enumerators go out, and they're going to compute the price in the background during the household interview. And then at the end, we quote it as a take it or leave it offer. So we say, here's this price. If you're willing to, we give them a 500 CFA gift. And if they say they would prefer the price, they have access to this for 18 months. And if they say no, we say, OK, that's great. But you can't buy from us. Right? We wait 18 months, and then we run the end line. Yeah. Whoa. We're going to have to speed up. So at the cluster level, we're looking at the mechanical market share. Right? So these are our first set of regressions. They're at the cluster level. And then we're looking at the market share by group. Right? So we use the double selection lasso, like Bologna et al., using a bunch of control variables. That's how we're picking our controls. Right? The market share for the control group is on average 84% for mechanical. But in the 10K group, it's about 58.9. And then in the 20K group, it's 99.3. Right? So this is some evidence that we're actually picking out relatively poor and relatively rich households. Here's the 6% in the pooled regression that I talked about earlier. But the treatment effect is concentrated almost entirely in the 10K group. Right? So they're the people who are driving the treatment effect, and they're the people where we actually had the headroom to have an impact. Right? We can also do these at the household level. Right? In this case, we're thinking about any mechanical by this household and any manual by a household. And the impact on mechanical is approximately equal to the negative impact on manual. So what we are doing is moving people from manual here to mechanical here. Does that sound good? Now, in terms of estimating the impact on health, the actual question that we ask is, what is the probability that a household reports that at least one child had a case of diarrhea in the past 7 days? Right. So in the pooled regression, the probability decreases by 1.2%, but it's not statistically significant. And the way that we set this up is the percent. So we look at the percentage of households in your cluster who are in the 10K group. So if you have a bunch of poor neighbors and you have more of those people, right, that's where you're going to get treatment effects, right? Because we're kind of cleaning up the neighborhood. Right? And that's what you see in the 10% level. So there is a statistically significant 5 percentage point decrease in reported diarrhea in this 10K group. Right? So this effect size is similar to in rural areas building toilets, actually. Like if you compare it to the epidemiology literature.
So do you see any spillovers there? I mean,
Yeah.
is the decline in the bottom group?
Yeah. So if you have more poor neighbors who are treated through the platform, that's where you're getting more of a treatment effect. Right.
But is the treatment effect happening for those poor people or for other non-poor people living close to them?
Yeah, so they're counted in the, it's kind of like a reflection thing. They're counted in the group who are poor in that neighborhood.
But you have household level data.
Yeah.
You could sort it out.
Yeah.
The household level.
Yeah. So what's significant in this regression is the number in the, like when we interact treatment with the level of the treatment in your neighborhood. That's the thing that comes out significant. Compared to the control group neighborhoods of similar levels of subsidization. So the spillovers are really important. Yeah. Okay. Good. So that's this last point. Like, it's the neighborhoods with more households that are experiencing the biggest declines in diarrhea. So there are some alternative mechanisms that you might be interested in. One would be that we're kind of improving their bargaining power so that they can take our price and go and negotiate with like their regular desludger. Another one that would be that we're kind of like subsidizing experimentation. There's a little bit of evidence that the people who've never had mechanical desludging are more likely to purchase through us than people who have before. So I just want to skip ahead to one last thing. So we put together a counterfactual model where we use the data from the auction group to predict the willingness to pay and distribution of households conditional on their observables in the fixed price treatment group. And then we use that at, like you can imagine in Loj, what you're doing is you're assuming that that distribution is normal, mean zero, right? But what we're doing now is saying like, well, look, we have great data about willingness to pay for those households. So let's estimate that distribution from the auction group, that first group of people, and then we can use it to think about how people behave on the platform. Right? So with that, we put together some counterfactuals. One would be proxy means testing. One would be an auction where we just pass them the prices we're getting in our procurement auction. And one would be if we centralize the market. So we're going to stabilize the price at the prevailing market average, and we're going to kind of ignore GE effects. Okay. So what happens to treatment effects, here's our predicted treatment effect using the model. Here's the control group. We have a statistically significant impact here, but our other options are broadly comparable. There's an improvement relative to the control group, but it's not statistically significant. And that occurs both in the pooled and in the 10K group. So that's 10K and that's pooled. To understand why that's the case, we can think about how much money is actually going to people, how much of those subsidy dollars is actually getting to them. So the way I'm going to think about that is, what's the probability that they arrange through us, given the price we quote them in their observables? And then I'm going to look at what is the fraction of the cost that we're paying. Right. So what we would like is for us to give a more negative value to poor households and a more positive value to rich households. And that's exactly what we get. So in the experiment, what's happening is there's a bunch of poor households who are in the 10K group, and we're subsidizing them about 4.75%. Where on the other side, we have these relatively rich households, the 20 and the 17.5, they're paying in. And then we have this 15,000 group who's being subsidized a little, but not a ton. Now, proxy means testing, there's a bunch of people who just get thrown out. They're like, I don't even want to hear from you. You're not poor by our rule, so get out of here. But then there's a bunch of poor, rich, and otherwise people who are all kind of clumped together just below 2.5%. Right? And it's the same thing if you were to look at an auction. It's not the same. So you don't have this, but you're subsidizing everybody, right, at relatively low rates. The big winners here are the rich people who are, relatively rich people who, instead of paying into the system over there, now they're being subsidized, but at a very low rate. Right? And yeah.
Why would you, I guess I understand you're looking at a specific problem, but if you stepped out a little bit and thought about the government's problem,
Yeah.
you're charging the rich people more than you would otherwise need to, so you can get some money to subsidize the poor people.
Yes.
But wouldn't it be better for the government to just tax, vodka or something, or wages, and use that to subsidize the poor people who do it, rather than tax this specific good in particular, which is a good that creates positive externalities?
Yeah. So that depends on the market share of the platform. If I am an NGO who doesn't have access to instruments like that,
Yeah.
or I'm in a relatively weak regime where I'm the head of ONEA, but I can't say like, you go raise taxes on vodka,
Yeah.
and this is my problem, which is in countries with weak institutions, that's a serious issue. What I'm really doing is saying, hey, look, rich people, I know they're charging you like 19. What if I charged you 17.5? Right? And they, this is incentive compatible, individually rational. So the rich people who are paying in are happy because what we're doing is undercutting the desludgers who would have charged them higher prices in the first place. So there's, everybody can kind of benefit without making anybody worse off is part of the plan. Does that? Yeah, I'm at 0 minutes. So, and then just like the budget balance, sorry, just conclusion. I'll leave that up. Anyway, sorry, what was your?
I just want to say, isn't an alternative mechanism just for it to be more group-based or neighborhood group-based to actually, because of these externalities?
Yeah.
You can imagine us,
Yeah.
you could offer a subscription service where the truck goes around to that neighborhood and collects all the sludge from that area.
Yeah.
And then people would be willing to pay potentially much more for
Yeah.
that.
So you would have to get
Instead of
people to
those
pay.
things are all individual.
Yeah, so this service is something you need every 6 to 18 months. And getting people to pay subscription fees for a good that they require at that frequency is a difficult thing to do.
I mean even exposed, not even, I don't mean paid up.
Yeah, to really get that to work for you, you would need to somehow bunch the jobs and do them in bulk to get the desludgers to kind of pay for packages, right? Like I've got this neighborhood. Like if the jobs are not super correlated in time, it would be really hard to get some kind of group. What is the group doing for you? Right. I think maybe you're thinking they price the externalities into their own demand, and if I could guarantee.
The trucks come back, they make this long trip, and they come back with only a portion of them filled.
It's not. It's 2/3 or more per household.
Oh,
So you would,
household,
yeah,
okay.
you need it this day. We need 2 or 3 households done at the same time in order to make those repeated trips kind of cancel out, and then there's gains from trade. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then. I just go this. So in settings where legal institutions are weak, setting up these platforms, you can actually use this as a policy carrot and still achieve some of your objectives, making people better off, reducing diarrhea, getting subsidies to the people who need them. Thanks.
All right, thanks a lot for having me here. I'm not a development economist. I work on I/O, so I think this discussion might be a bit off topic, or I might have focused on something that you guys wouldn't want to focus on. But I found this to be a really interesting paper, so I just thought I'd share the things that jumped out to me. So I think of this paper as sort of an expanded structural paper. It has many of the components of a structural paper, and then it has more. I think Chris and I have both drunk the Kool-Aid, so in some sense, if you asked us, how would you estimate the effect of a platform like this, we would estimate demand, run the counterfactual of targeting prices, and then just say that we figured out the answer. But you guys do more. You actually go into Burkina Faso, you implement the counterfactual, you estimate those effects. So that seems pretty interesting. And you can complement the demand estimation exercise with this sort of elicitation exercise. And in principle, it's like 2 ways to estimate something that looks like demand. So there's another avenue through which you can check these structural results. So I found that pretty exciting, coming from I/O. So the mechanism design part of it that Terry went through in a lot of detail is essentially that conditional on observables, posted prices are optimal. You have to adjust the Meyerson formula a bit to deal with the budget balance constraint, but you essentially have this effect. So the problem reduces to, you see a bunch of X's for people. How do you select the price for them so that you can maximize demand or take up both within and outside the platform, conditional on this, or subject to this budget constraint? Okay, so important problem, really important setting, especially in I/O. We look at things like the market for flavored cream cheese. So this is really it's good to see these methods applied elsewhere. Yeah. So this paper estimates demand estimates something that looks like demand from market transactions. This is sort of like estimating an outside option in the context of the paper. Then they're going to supplement the demand estimates using this solicitation mechanism to get willingnesses to pay. Then they'll compute prices as a function of these observables using this program to maximize demand. And then they will implement this policy, and then I just see what happens. Somehow I looked at a different table, I guess. The real number should be 6.5%, not 5.2%. But point is that if you, after this effect increases the market share of mechanical desludging, most of it comes from the guys who had the highest subsidy. And they do, I guess, a bunch of counterfactuals, only one of which I read in the paper, although maybe I didn't. So it turns out that it's better than a lot of other possible counterfactuals. And these counterfactuals are actually done as counterfactuals. These aren't actually implemented in practice. So my first overarching comment, is sort of like, there's a bit of I was having a hard time figuring out what you wanted us to take away from this. Like, is this the 6.5%, which I called the 5.2% up there, should we just think of this as this is the maximum possible amount you could increase the market share? Or is this the estimate? Should we think about the the demand model as giving us a good prediction of this estimate? I just wasn't, the issue with having a paper that has so many different approaches coupled into one was that I wasn't sure how to interpret this number, but that was almost like a side comment. So how do I think about this question? I think there are two effects: one random musing, and then one part that I find really interesting that isn't really addressed in this paper, or maybe shouldn't be addressed as part of this paper. So first of all, prices decrease for a lot of people, and in principle, they should have access to the same outside option, maybe. So that's one important effect. The second effect that is also important is that now it's easier to find a mechanical desludger if you're part of the call center, so the search costs go down. So those two effects are two different parts of that 6.5%. This random musing is just me trying something that this reminded me of. After you do the optimal mechanism stuff, it turns out that the optimal mechanism looks sort of like third-degree price discrimination. So you're sort of conditioning prices on X's. Just like a monopolist, if you let a monopolist third-degree price discriminate prices, profits have to go up. Here, if you let a demand-maximizing planner price discriminate, then output has to go up. So if you think about it like that, I wasn't sure whether the result was that it's good that output went up because we targeted people properly, or whether this is the maximum that output could possibly have gone up. And the reason I brought this up is that it's true in the monopoly case, or the single agent or the single social planner case, you have these trivial results that a monopolist has to be able to do better by price discriminating. But the thing about this setting is that if you move from a monopolist to an oligopolist, all of a sudden it's not clear what happens if you let people price discriminate. Similarly, you do have an outside market here. So if you let the planner sort of price discriminate, and you think about a setting where this is scaled up a lot, then it's not clear to me like what the net effects are going to be. So this sounds like this is a really interesting part going forward. So essentially, all these three things I think are related to what I think is sort of interesting, which is if you scale the platform up, you're going to have competitive structure. The competitive structure of the outside market is going to change to the extent that you're positioning this as sort of a contribution to mechanism design with like an outside market. It would be interesting to have a bit more of a discussion and try to explore like what happens to the outside market, maybe in this paper and in a future paper. So I have 3 quick comments. I know I have like 3 minutes, so I'll try to do this quickly. The first comment was about demand estimation. So again, I like the fact that you can elicit willingness to pay essentially by going around and asking them about willingness to pay. We're not sure whether this is willingness to pay or ability to pay, but we don't really care about this number anyway, except for choices, so it doesn't really matter for us since we're not doing any welfare calculations with this number. And it's important to try to figure out what, to do this because you're going to reduce prices to the point where you don't see them in the data. I had 2 comments about this. I just don't know what the answer to this is. Like if you go around asking people, tell me what you're willing to pay for a service that you have never used. Like I don't know what I'm willing to pay for BMW. It just hasn't like crossed my mind to make that calculation. So I don't know what the take is on the literature for like how trustworthy these numbers are. The second point I want to make is that you are eliciting, I think, a slice of the demand curve. So the willingness to pay conditioning on the outside market being what it is. So like I'm willing to pay like $22,000 for a Civic, but if BMWs were free, I'd be willing to pay 0. So it is important to take that into account. It is like a part of the demand curve. You're trying to supplement, so one way you could try to address both these questions is supplement these willingness to pay things with estimates from a demand model, at least on the region you do see prices. And so my comment there was that you have a model that looks like this. This is not what I would have called a demand model. It looks a lot like a pricing equation, which is a dirty word in I/O because it's not clear whether the pricing equation is supply or demand or some combination. Essentially, it's not clear what it's immutable to. I think that's okay for you for this paper just because it's like the working assumption is that it's immutable to everything. Like nothing is changing in that environment, right? So this is just like a good prediction tool for what's going to happen when or what price a particular household would have paid. So if that's the case, I just wouldn't call it a demand model. But maybe that's just nomenclature. But on the other hand, to answer some of these questions that Michael brought up, for instance, you need a cross-price elasticity to understand, like if you tax manual desludging, how much that the demand for mechanical desludging is going to change. That model is not going to give you a cross-price elasticity. Neither is the willingness to pay elicitation. So why not just go ahead and estimate demand? It's a pretty standard discrete choice setup. You probably have cross-shifters that vary by neighborhood. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And it would let you do more counterfactuals down the line. The second point is you see this price dispersion. If you want to think about how the market or the platform interacts with the outside market, I think the source of that price dispersion is pretty important. We talked over email and you said it was price discrimination, but it could also be differences in bargaining power. It could also just be a stall type search model. I don't know what sort of products are grouped into this distribution. So if there's heterogeneity in just the cost of delivery, it could be that as well. So understanding how much, essentially what causes that is going to be important to understand how the market interacts with the platform interacts with the market. And it's going to help clean up some of these casual statements in the paper, like the outside option is orthogonal to the willingness to pay conditional on X, which is not going to be the case in like a bargaining model, for instance. So, so I think it would essentially giving us a bit more color on the outside option would help us think about what's going to change when you scale this model up. So, yeah. So essentially, I think that's. I'm probably out of time now, so I'll just wrap up pretty quickly. I think moving forward, a good thing to think about is what's going to happen to these. Think about these equilibrium effects with the supply side. How that decentralized market change is going to depend on how these prices are set, like I said in the previous slide. If you want to think about changes to the market for manual desludging, like taxes or something, then you need to understand these cross-price subsidies. And I don't know exactly how you think about structural modeling, but if you think about this as just like a rough rule of thumb for understanding how large these effects could possibly be, if you're scaling this program up, then it's important to get those numbers right. And 3 quick comments. I guess it would be nice to just see what the 6.5 would have been in the model and then see how close you are to that, just because it would make you validate the exercise a bit more. I know you said that you're going to make the supply side a different paper, but there's some work on sequential mechanisms versus auctions that show that sequential mechanisms do a bit better. It's sort of interesting to see if that's the case. I don't have time to talk about that. And last thing is you talk about this, the title is Targeting Through Mechanism Design. There are a lot of mechanisms being designed in the whole paper, so I wasn't sure, like, you might want to specify that a bit. But yeah, I enjoyed the paper a lot. Thanks a lot.
So Terence, probably you either have time to take a question or quickly respond to Vivek.
Yeah, questions are great. Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to ask about the supply side. You brought this up also. I guess there is an obvious concern if you're going to scale this to think about the supply side, but you also said that this market is very thin. And so even though you don't have huge scale, given how thin these markets are, there's a lot of bargaining, assuming that there is no supply response at all, seems, right, the two don't really connect.
Yeah.
So what's the kind of justification for keeping the supply side of it? I mean, you're assuming everything's fixed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're worried about entry, or
Well,
not
like
entry, or
anything,
just
I
like
mean,
what happens
No,
when
but
you scale up?
if you were really a small, you're a tiny NGO in this huge market, it'd be fine. But you're not. You're a small NGO in a very heterogeneous, a ton of thin markets, right? Where we're kind of bargaining a lot and people are being held up. So are people have the providers changed the prices they're offering in the time you run the mechanism? Has anything happened to the supply at all?
So we can't really say anything about that because that's going to be net of the control group. All we have those treatment effects. If we put together, so my guess is like in a structural model, if you set it up, what's going to happen is the big question is who is selecting onto the platform? Is it high willingness to pay households or low willingness to pay households or something else? And as that goes on, you're going to be truncating the distribution in the other markets. So if it's all the rich people who get on the platform, you're cutting that off. Prices are going to have to fall in some sense in the search market. And then in equilibrium, like how this, or if it goes the other way and the poor people are on the platform, it depends how that process goes to answer your question of what happens. Does that, because then the equilibrium of the search market would be the distribution of reserve prices and then the distribution of prices quoted.
We should probably take remaining questions offline, actually. So, thank you.